Could you actually elaborate a little more on some of the structures and the models that you were talking about in your talk, and how those were built and how they came about, especially in terms of how you built it collaboratively and with, in terms of how it was built out of practice rather than building a model first?
The idea of basically the way contemporary art institutions work, and I'm sure also ancient art museums work the same. It's such a production cycle that you're always in this game of producing, traveling, making sure there's a bit of an afterlife of the exhibition that you're doing. But it's such a sustaining mechanism that I thought maybe, okay, let's just take a step back and let's really do a bit of slow cooking. Let's do it over long term, stretch it as much as we can. Is it always successful in the sense of, communication to the audiences? It's a very hard one to also communicate, saying we're doing pre-production, not only production, presentation, and post-production, but we're also looking at the time where the work is being produced. Because for me, the most delicious part of an exhibition making or a performance production is actually the preparation part. Like, take me to the backstage, that's where I want to live. The minute it's sort of put out there, I'm not maybe as much. It's a very hard one to also communicate, saying we're doing pre-production, not only production, presentation, and post-production, but we're also looking at the time where the work is being produced. Because for me, the most delicious part of an exhibition making or a performance production is actually the preparation part. Like, take me to the backstage, that's where I want to live. The minute it's sort of put out there, I'm not maybe as much feeling the heat of things. So the inner belly, where you really see the performing of the mind of the artist, as much as you see it, of course, when it's put on stage. To me, it's really precious. So I wanted to see if there are ways to actually make that visible. But of course, a white cube is very resistant to the idea, because the white cube only wants exhibitions. Like, it just doesn't want anything else. Feed me, feed me, feed me, feed me with exhibitions. I'm happy, audiences are happy.
And by exhibitions, do you mean objects?
Yeah, not the exhibition in the way you have described it in your introduction today, but more in the regular way of what is expected from an exhibition. So I guess that's my answer.
Does anyone have any questions for one another in the panel? No, I'm just speaking to the speakers. Anthony, do you have any questions for anyone in the panel, or anyone in the panel has a question for someone else who spoke? We'll give them a chance to come up with a question for each other.
Ming Wang, I was curious, I'm over here, hi. I was curious why the figure of the female astronaut or space traveler was of interest to you in particular. If you could talk about that as the metaphor.
Right. I didn't want to make a male figure because that's too obvious. And I think being a position of an artist and the way I work, I always tend to go for the more contested kind of figure, be it whether it's gender, nationality, language, body size, whatever it is. It's a figure that's the female space explorer is. I think it's a kind of metaphor where a lot of people project a lot of their own desires onto this figure. You don't know whether it's somebody that you could trust, whether it's the enemy, whether it's one of us. You don't know whether she's kind of more masculine or more feminine. I think it's kind of, it's ambiguous, and that's why I think it's more interesting for me.
Yes, I have a question for Helen Cutter. As you acknowledged in your presentation, the city, New York, has been quite unfriendly until recently regarding non-Western artists. I mean, MoMA for the first time is showing, is giving a retrospective to a Middle Eastern artist. So what I'm going to say is that my question is that your reviews have been truly heartwarming because you've been bringing intelligence, knowledge, and the heart to it. But I was also wondering if you don't think we need a little bit more tougher criticism of non-Western artists.
This is working? Yes, it is. Okay, good. Yeah, I think it's valuable always to take a critical look at people. In my own situation, it has been mostly, though, that there have been so few up until recently that it's mostly a question for me of getting information out and across to people. It's easy to discourage people who are not inclined to want to see art, a show anyway, to stay away from it, to have an excuse, well, it got a bad review, so I'm not going to go see it. I don't want to do that. I haven't wanted to do that with a lot of exhibitions, and I've been lucky that I'm able to choose pretty much what I want to cover, so I know that what I'm going to be writing about is something that I feel good about myself, and therefore I can be an advocate for that show. If it's a show that I personally don't think is good or worthy, I tend to sometimes step aside and not do it. It depends on the situation entirely. It depends on how much attention that artist has had so far in their careers, how much they're likely to get in their careers, how much market support they have. In that case, if it's a lot of all those things, I'll step in and say what I want to say. If it's not, and I think that a lot hinges on this artist furthering an argument, and they're not doing it well, I'll just let it be. Maybe they should be ignored. Maybe that's a good time for people not to go and give it another chance. Once the market levels out and we have enough of everybody, it'll be a whole different ballgame. We can go ahead and do what we want.
I want to add something as well, because I remember showing a performance by Robbie Mrue as part of Performa at PS 122, and I remember a leading art critic, who doesn't happen to be, of course, Helen Cutter, coming and saying to me, "Oh, we don't need him, there's already Walid Raad." So the quota for Middle Eastern artists actually was so limited, let's say 8 years ago, that it was only him that would, I mean, this is somebody everybody knows. And also now with New York pricing out artists from Manhattan, possibly Brooklyn and so forth, there is also more and more non-New York artists flooding institutional spaces or galleries. Like, the time has come also as a result of there is not enough New York artists. And maybe it's a bit of a shallow reading, but I think the gates have opened up much more because there's also need.
It struck me that a number of you guys on this panel talked about a contraction of different times and geographic locations. So Chinese opera and science fiction, ancient writings and modern American texts, Ljubljana and Korea, and Holland, you talked about your personal history in Boston and New York contemporary art. So I find that really interesting as a contrast to what we think of as the now of performance. The other thing I think that goes along with that is at least two, but I think three of you mentioned the word ethics in art, whether it was an ethics of ancient art and how that relates to kind of social norms, or the question of does your soul go away when you shoot the arrow? My question is this: can you describe that ethics? Like, I want to not just know about that there are ethics in art, but I'm wondering if you could articulate what those ethics are.
Is this on? Can I? I'll just get this out of the way. I think there would probably only be sincerity, and if that word were to replace truth, reality, I think that my interest in what I was asked to talk about today, my interest was in the exchange between artist and audience, between writer and reader, and I think if the exchange is sincere and there are an ethics pondered in there somewhere, they're part of the reality of the exchange. But that's it for me.
One thing I'll say, because I write about other art than contemporary art, I write, historical art, whatever. One thing is the idea that, over the centuries, a lot of really beautiful art has been created for really terrible reasons. And the Metropolitan Museum is full of art that has been created for terrible reasons that nonetheless is very beautiful to look at, and has and it's complicated, ethically, and that complicates it, I think. And I try to write to some degree about that, why, when you're looking at something, how you might think about considering it, not just the pleasure principle.
I didn't mention ethics, but
I wonder if we need to use another word, because
no.
I heard not necessarily ethics, but consciousness several times.
I didn't use it, but I'm going to quote a friend and a colleague, Ulay, and he always says, art without ethics is cosmetics.
That's fantastic.
Can I just mention, too, a little advertisement for OHO, that they're in a show at MoMA now. It's a wonderful show, so it's worth catching. Yeah.
Come on. Another question? Don't be shy.
Sorry, it's for Ishvan. Again, going back to ethics. You were talking about being in Korea and going through these archives. I'm not sure if any of those artists are currently living, but talking about the ethics again of taking these images, making a new work out of them. So how do you sort of play through some of those issues as you create your work from these materials?
Yeah, of course, it's one of the questions. Yeah, one is confronted when using these images, and I try to ignore it. Because if I wouldn't, then I would be doing something else. It's really like any kind of image. I just allow myself to use it. And if I meet someone who is who did that work, of course I'm open about it, that I used it, and I tell them that I used it for my work to create another image with that image. And until now, I had no legal problems.
But beyond legal, have you had conversation? I'm just curious about the conversation. If you
Yeah. Well, for example, the OHO members, they're all alive, and they've been informed by the museum that we were going to show their work in another form, and they're really not interested so much in it. They had basically no comments, and but this is from a previous situation, not regarding my work. Once they were also asked about some of the early works that they did, and I think it was David Nys who was talking about that it happened at that time, and it was really enjoyable, and they find it nice that if somebody younger or not is intrigued by that image and uses it, and it's they just find it nice, but they don't have a true relationship with it anymore. I think this is more problematic when I would use an image of somebody who is dead, and the market is in charge of that. that becomes more problematic actually. Artist-to-artist exchange, I think, has never been truly like that kind of a problem, at least not maybe for the images that I've been using. I know that recently there was a lot of lawsuits also with, because I live in Brussels, and and in Belgium there was recently a problem with Luc Tuymans because he used a photo from a newspaper, and it aroused a whole discussion about whether artists can use a photo from a medium like a newspaper or internet to recreate the work or to repaint it, or etc. I think it's an interesting question, but I never had as I said from the beginning, the first thing I try to ignore it.
Mainly for Holland Cotter, because at a certain point you mentioned about realizing the kind of third voice, third language that's being created through art, as opposed to it just being a manifestation, kind of a recreation of a Western model, but that there's actually a third voice being put through, and so of course it makes me think about third space, yeah, and this whole notion of third space and what that is, what its potential is, because I guess my question becomes, third spaces, one of the big problems with third spaces is that they're temporary often, yeah, and the control to access, or the creation of those spaces are still, the control is still in the hands of, say, kind of Eurocentric or Western or whatever we want to call them, models and institutions. And so access will be given and then access will be denied, and still controlled from a particular place. How is it possible to make third spaces not temporary anymore? And is simple access going to be enough to dismantle the control over the access? You know, that there need to be new centers developed. So yeah, I mean, we have to move beyond just access being given to non-Western art and artists.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's a question of power balance, and the power still is in the West as far as the market goes, as far as advertising goes, or what you're going to see or not see. I'm hoping that power will gradually shift. It looks like it's doing a little bit of shifting now. My main contact with that is through ACAW, which is the International Association of Art Critics. And I see that our...
Holland, can you please use your mic?
Yeah. And I'm ACAW, the International Association of Art Critics, which has a very large Euro-American contingent. And it's basically been a Euro-American organization. But we're getting a larger number of people from other places in the world now who are forming their own branches, and they're part of the general thing. So that's my main contact with it. And I see critics, young writers in various parts of the world that we weren't aware of before, but we're aware of now. And they come to New York, and we go, I don't actually, but the ACAW people go to their meetings. So I think we need that for one thing. We just have more personnel, international personnel, than we've had before. That's one way to start it, so that other people, instead of us, here, are writing about art. People on the ground in, say, for West Africa, for example. I met with some ACAW people there, members of ACAW, in Bamako, Mali, in Dakar, in Abidjan, and it's hard for them because they have very little infrastructure, very little support, almost nothing in the way of outlets, but they're doing that work, and that's wonderful, and that's how it's going to change.
Also, the third spaces, you're right. It's like what you see in China. I can't comment on every part of Asia, but it's been sort of mimicking of Western museological models, and without learning from the mistakes at all, just copying and pasting and applying, and some collapsed, and there's another 10 that are born in the last 2 years, let's say, in Shanghai. But it is Western model. It's something I also had a discussion with my board, like, okay, we're calibrating the content at vite de vite, easy to do, relatively, right? But nevertheless, the DNA of the institution remains to be Western, according to my board, because we are risk-taking, because we are experimental, and because we're that. Those are fundamentally Western values. So it's totally, the third space is a complete conundrum, and maybe the diagram that I shared in one slide, the Art of Asia, how it's sort of constructed in its Byzantium, is a potentiality for a third space. I'm not saying perfect, because it's three friends, you know, it's not an institution. We just came together, make things happen, and that's how things happen anyway. But it is a copy-paste situation, still, in my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, there are, of course, incredible networks and self-generating models, like look at Sarai, or look at, I mean, there are alternatives, but it's not many. Yeah.
But I would say the thread that runs in this morning's group of performative talks is for me the third space, which I call history. It is a place to still unearth in very surprising and inspiring ways, in the way that Anthony did this morning. The connection with this 2,000-year-old unauthored epic poem and American literature. And in the same way, in thinking about Chinese opera, being part of a popular culture of future science fiction, in the same way that Holland has been unearthing, in a way, history by thinking about the contemporary. And I was really moved by what he said, and if we were to switch and think contemporary and history and contemporary. I can't, of course, remember exactly what he said, but it was very poignant. And in the same way that Daphne is shifting the institutional role to incorporate life, energy, and the process itself, in the same way that Isfan is unearthing something that to me actually is incredibly not surprising. It's actually, of course it makes sense that, a group in Slovenia and another group in Korea are going to be making work that look and feel exactly the same. It is beautiful that we're surprised by it, but on the other hand, if we think about human experience, collective consciousness, and that the experience, it doesn't have to be groups of people. In fact, an Uzbek artist completely isolated by the Cold War in the 1970s was making the exact same works almost in his secret notebooks that Namjoon Paik was doing with television sets. So it is, the third space is really what's happening with artists shifting just from image thinking to actually incorporating images and history without shame or guilt, and but with insight. What did it mean then? How is it? How can it be significant today? And why should we even look at this? So I do have one question though for Anthony, because he's kind of like this non-necessarily visual artist in this group, and he's an intervention with the idea of performance, and I feel like maybe he can share a little bit as to what performance actually means to him as a novelist, because I think he performed it for us, but maybe we need it a little bit more literally. Thank you. On the spot.
I'm sorry. I thought it would be a softball question. It's a softball question. Because it doesn't have to be proved. I think that the responsibility to create something performative, the notion of the idea of performance actually came up in a discussion that you and I were having. I realized that you sit alone at a chair, you sit alone at a desk and you work, but you have as the goal in mind the imagination and the consciousness of somebody you have never met. And what it is that you intend to share with them is the creation of some, in my case, fictional character who talks, walks, looks certain ways. And when you put that character into a certain scene or a series of scenes, if somebody picks up your novel and they read that novel, that character will live and talk and act that way, will perform in their imagination forever. And so it was a kind of perpetual, it was an attempt, when we were talking about it, I saw novel writing as an attempt at a sort of perpetual performance, an unending performance in the imagination. And that's how all this got started for you and me. So that's the answer.
Gracias. Any more questions? Yes, Joanne.
I want to come back to this idea of a third space and our surprise at the connections between Korea and Slovenia or wherever else. I think we grossly underestimate the level of communication that has gone on over the past 100 years. And print was used as a means of communicating over enormous distances. And one of the things that surprised me was in learning that in Britain they were publishing information about the works of art that were being removed from the major museums in China within 2 weeks. And it's the question of the reproduction. And I think that's how a lot of the information was being transmitted. And we undervalue the impact of that.
So, yeah, I agree with you, but I think I don't want to confuse the notion of third space with kind of world systems or globalization or the fact that ideas and concepts have happened in different places at different times and maybe they've come from one place to another, because that's very different, in my opinion, than a third space where actual power structures are dismantled. The idea that people are doing something in Slovenia and Korea and that the Bhagavad Gita and American German, I mean, that's not surprising to me, actually, because I think ideas and flows of thoughts and philosophies and these things have been happening for hundreds and thousands of years. But it's these contemporary power structures that exist specifically in the form of contemporary art institutions, museums, and things where the control is still kind of in the West, so to speak, as a lack of a better term, like you said, in quotes, the West. But that's where my interest lies more, about like how does that kind of develop?
But your definition sounds to be a bit different than Aman's definition. And what I find fascinating with the history of print is it's such a colliding of Buddhism and Christianity. I mean, sort of when you look at the interaction of the religions, and when Christianity was moving in, let's say, into China, and how Buddhists picked up right away with the strategy of printing, and sort of the 20s of Shanghai, you really see how print has accelerated. First the missionaries came, then the Buddhists responded. It's such an incredibly delicious time, and Lu Xun kicking in, and probably a bit of science fiction was generated at the time. And to me, what's interesting is now, like in 21st century, to look how internet is functioning in the shaping of culture, right? So it's not like nobody is interested anymore in these grand cultural paradigms of exoticized differences, and so everybody is actually interested in more like quick transmissions, slippages, synchronicities. We thought the same, and it's so much more visible that you think of the same thing between Uzbekistan and, like, it's actually much more visible now that we're so much more connected in that sense. So I would compare that period more into how it accelerated and became more in sync, and that third space, did it shrink? Is there a third space? It's different what your interpretation, which, but.
I mean, I just add something to what you were saying, though. And I was recently invited to go to MoMA at a round table. They had a bunch of curators from various countries that MoMA brought to New York for a 2-week, I think it was 2-week training period, basically. You know, introductory period. Let's see how our museum works, see how a bunch of museums in the city work. And comes out of their old international program. It's actually still part of it. So we had, and 2 of those curators who were here were from Africa. One was from Dakar and one was from Lagos. And particularly the Lagos curator, who helped found a museum in Lagos, had founded a very interesting museum. It's a museum that doesn't have a center, it doesn't have a home, it moves around, ends up in shopping malls and all kinds of places. It is a collecting museum, however. It has a storage facilities to collect, so it can actually benefit artists by buying it and benefit everybody by being able to keep it and let people see it beyond its ordinary lifespan. So it is a different model from the models we have, is the point. But this artist was being brought to MoMA to learn how it's done the right way. Yeah, you know, right. But what MoMA should be doing is going to Lagos and seeing how that artist is, those people are creating that museum, because the people in Lagos are creating a museum for an entirely different audience, which includes the MoMA type audience, but also other people. So, but that's only going to happen when MoMA agrees to do that, you know, to start that process. But that's the way it should be. My whole interest in Africa, well, way back, but in African museums started because 15 or 20 years ago, when I first started writing for the Times, I happened to be invited to one of these roundtables, and there were 12, I think, curators, some of whom I still know, but it was so clear to me that the different models were. There were 2 from South Africa, where the infrastructure is there. They were very Western-style museums we were being shown. Everybody was presenting their institution for us to see. One from Ethiopia, Meskrem Asagwet, who was in town recently. And Meskrem's had started her own art center, which is still going, and that was an entirely different model, too. There's nothing in New York City like Meskrem's center in Addis. So anyway, I learned so much from that, you know. I learned so much from the fact that some of the people who were giving those presentations could afford pictures to show us, and others could not afford pictures to show us. Some had catalogs, some wouldn't think of doing catalogs, didn't have the money to do it. Some, you know, I can go on. But the point is, we need to learn from them, from those things. Yeah.
Actually, Aman, it's interesting because you're asking those questions, because you and I were involved in the first franchise of Documenta and outside of Kassel in 2012 in Kabul. And everyone was, first of all, there was this whole paranoia of keeping it secret, because it just was kind of unexplainable in a way, of how would it be received, because there is this like fear of being judged about going into some place and implementing or implanting them with whatever knowledge you have. And so that created a lot of just chaotic energy that didn't really allow fluidity in my fluidity of communication. So I think it's just about time that we all just relax and let go of all this justification and paranoia. Things have gone wrong, things have been done wrong, but we can try to make it okay. And one of the most interesting conversations that happened was in Zulekha Sherzad's studio, where she makes beautiful clothes, Afghan clothes, with traditional materials from Afghanistan, still all handmade and processed. I can't recall the philosopher who was there, invited to do a keynote, and we were going on and off about what's the benefit of this and who benefits from this and why is Documenta in Kabul, and I don't know how it came about, but it was said that it was not that Kabul or Afghanistan needs Documenta, but Documenta that needed Afghanistan. And that really was it. And there is no need to justify it further, and there's no need to create a whole campaign around it. It's just that we all needed to be there and feel it out and experience it and figure out what happened there in the 70s and what's happening with it now, and risk the whole thing. So I think it's also the power structure. It will slowly, as the way that Holland Cotter just in his beautiful talk this morning, he actually shared through his own story the story of how the city has in a way transformed. But it's still in an infantile stage, I would say, absolutely. But with that note, I think I'm sorry, but we're going to have to go unless anyone has a burning thought. We have lunch for the presenters in the green room right here. Everybody else, please go grab the best thing you can around here and come back, because the feast is here, not out there. Okay? Thank you so much.